Awesome. So for the sake of time, I think we will get started. Definitely continue to chat in your name and your organization into the chat box within Whova. It's great to see a mix of very familiar names as well as some new ones. I think it'll be awesome to get all of the different perspectives during our conversation today. So just to get started today, we're going to be sharing a little bit about the COVID-19 impact on the My School DC application and enrollment trends. First off, I want to thank the DC Data Summit sponsors for helping to make all of this possible and giving us the platform to do so. And then I wanted to share a few introductions. So for those of you who I have not met or chatted with previously, my name is Michelle. I am the Director of Data and Strategy for My School DC. I manage our application data, our relationship with schools and LEAs as it pertains to their applications, and the ongoing research and analysis that we conduct as well as third parties conduct in partnership with us.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Aryan. I'm the Director of Partnerships and Engagement with My School DC. I'm responsible for the partnership and engagement work, working with government, school and community partners, as well as direct family engagement, ensuring that families are informed of the lottery application process and deadlines, as well as how to access the application. And I also manage the communications aspect of our work, including putting on the citywide school fair, which hopefully most of you have been to, EdFest, which takes place in December every year. So thank you so much for joining us.
Awesome. So just to get started, get a few logistics out of the way. If this is your first presentation during the Data Summit, just wanted to go over a few things. One is that you are automatically muted right now as you're joining. If you do have a question, we encourage you to continue to use that chat function within Whova to ask your questions. If it's a lengthy question that you'd rather say out loud, just let us know in Whova and we can unmute you so that you can share your question. We do recommend joining via your desktop link rather than through a phone. It'll just be easier to view the presentation and to make it full screen so that you're able to see everything. And throughout, we'll pause to take questions at the end of each section, and then at the end of the presentation, open it up for general Q&A. So because I know we have a pretty wide mix of folks joining us based on the chat, wanted to start with a little bit of context. My School DC is the common application and public school lottery for DC's public and public charter schools. And so this year we saw about 25,000 applications in our lottery cycle, and we've seen thus far about 5,000 additional post-lottery applicants, just for broad context. And so our goal for this session is really to share some of the citywide enrollment data that we have seen, knowing that COVID-19 has had an impact on schools and on families' enrollment decisions, and then share a few guiding questions, suggestions, ideas for how to take some of this information and use it both for your outreach planning as well as for your enrollment data planning for the upcoming school year. So again, we'll start with just some enrollment by the numbers before we share some of what we have heard from families about the enrollment experience. And then again, go into some guiding questions specifically for outreach planning and for how you can use some of your own data in conjunction with what we are sharing today. Awesome. So again, for broad context, just setting us in where we are at right now, given the public health advisories related to COVID-19, we adjusted our enrollment process this year. We started by releasing results at the end of March on the same timeline that we had initially planned to. And we usually give families about a month until May 1st to make their enrollment decisions if they were matched to a school. However, enrollment historically is in person. And so given the shift to distance learning this year and the closing of the physical buildings, we extended our enrollment deadline to June 15th. To allow families to have time to make their decisions and to allow schools time to stand up electronic and online enrollment systems as part of this. So as we dive into the data, I think something that's really important to keep in mind is the scope of My School DC data relative to the citywide information. And My School DC data, again, is just a subset of the overall enrollment picture. As we think about the total enrollment, we do have newly enrolling students who are enrolling with an application, and this will be any new students enrolling at a public charter school and any out-of-boundary DC public school students, and the pre-K3 and pre-K4 students. So these are all coming through My School DC because an application is required, and we have visibility into their enrollment decisions. However, there's also newly enrolling students who are enrolling at their in-boundary DC public school. That is not information that we are privy to. That is only visible to DC public schools. So in the numbers today, that information will not be included. And similarly, there is re-enrolling students at any given school. And again, this is only visible to the individual LEAs themselves. And so our trends will only capture that bucket of newly enrolling students with an application. And so as we go through, I think it's very important to take what we're saying in that context, but also to combine it with the information that you may have about your own schools to help create a more informed picture. Awesome. So at a high level, two of the comparisons that we have been looking at in detail throughout COVID-19 is the comparison of enrolled students to last year and the comparison of post-lottery applicants. Post-lottery applicants meaning those that are applying for the very first time after our deadlines in early February for high school and early March for pre-K 3 through 8. And essentially, most of these students have been applying in a COVID world, which is why we care very much about their behaviors during this time. So on the left-hand side, we have the lottery enrollments, which show the gap between 1920, which is in the black bar, and 2021, which is in the blue bar. And we've seen that right now, as of Monday, there's about a 15–16% gap between our current enrollment levels and the enrollment levels that we saw at the same time last year. And for those of us who have been joining some of our various sessions over the last couple months, you'll maybe remember that in mid-May, we saw a pretty significant gap here in the year-over-year enrollments, and this has been steadily decreasing. And so we are starting to see that gap close as families' decisions that maybe were previously delayed are starting to accelerate as they're preparing for the upcoming school year. So I think we may continue to see that this gap persists, but I think it certainly won't be as enormously dramatic as we saw in the late spring. And then on the right-hand side, we have our post-lottery applications. Remember, these are new applicants who applied after our lottery deadlines. We are seeing fewer applicants here, and this gap of about 30% has been persisting over the last few months. We haven't seen it close very dramatically, and it's been hovering around that 30% when comparing it to the same time in the previous year. And so we don't expect that it'll necessarily close very dramatically, and this is particularly important for schools that historically may have relied heavily on a flow of post-lottery applications to fill their seats. I think this gap is just something to keep in mind as you're making enrollment planning decisions. Now, focusing on that enrollment gap specifically, we want to look at what grade levels these gaps are coming from. So the overall gap between this year and last year is about 2,500 students. And you'll see that the largest decreases that we're seeing are coming from pre-K 3 and pre-K 4, which makes sense in the context that these are non-compulsory grades. Families have a couple options here, whether it's to keep students at home for another year or to enroll them in an early child care center that they may already have been at and be more comfortable with. And so we anticipate that this is where schools that serve these grade levels are going to feel that enrollment decline the most. At the non-entry level grades, we do still see gaps here, but I think it's important to remember that these students, one, need to be attending somewhere in the fall, and the hope is that schools are seeing higher re-enrollment levels at these grades as families may be choosing to stay in their current school where they have already had experience with the learning environment during COVID. And so while there may be gaps, again, in what my school DC is seeing in terms of our enrollment numbers, this is potentially being offset by what schools are seeing themselves in their returning student numbers. So what can we expect from enrollment moving forward? Comparing the activity by month to last year, we definitely saw significantly fewer enrollments in April and in March, with a huge spike coming in June due to the shifting of the enrollment deadline. And July looks like it's on track to outpace last year's July enrollments. I think there is a question of whether we'll see the outpacing extend through August or not. I think much of this will depend on the series of school announcements that are being made on fall learning plans, which will help families solidify what their decisions are for the fall. And then last piece here before we open it up to any questions, we look specifically at our post-lottery applicants, knowing that they are applying in a different universe that we're all living in. There's a question of whether we're seeing a different population of students applying. And the trends that we have seen that have been fairly consistent throughout the last couple months is that there are fewer post-lottery applicants who are applying for pre-K3 and pre-K4. Interestingly, at the high school level, a slightly greater percentage of our applicants are applying to grades 9 through 12. And we are not seeing any marked differences by ward. So in Ward 7 and 8, where the majority of our students live, we're seeing similar percentage of our applicants coming from those wards. And I think there was a question of whether there would be spikes from private schools. We have not seen a significant difference in the number of post-lottery applicants that are applying from a private school into a participating My School DC school. So that's an overview of some of the numbers we've seen. I'll pause there to see if there are any questions that we can answer now on the data pieces.
Michelle, there are currently no questions in the Q&A or the chat. So we may just want to move forward.
Perfect. Awesome. So the next piece we want to talk about is the family enrollment experience. So we've been gathering both qualitative and quantitative data on this throughout the lottery and post-lottery cycle to understand a bit more about how families are experiencing enrollment at this time. So we recently conducted our annual survey of our applicants. We gathered between 3,000 and 4,000 responses total, asking questions about families' experiences applying and enrolling. Most of these questions we ask year over year just to gauge any differences that we may be seeing. And a few of the questions that we typically ask are related to the top factor in families' decision-making process when applying to a school and then when enrolling or not enrolling at their matched school. So when applying on the left-hand side in the blue, we saw this year and historically what we've always seen is that the most important factor for choosing to apply to a school or not is proximity to home, followed pretty closely by a school's reputation. This does hold for enrolling and historically has held for the reason for not enrolling as well. But this year, of course, due to COVID-19, we added an answer choice around decisions that could have impacted, and did see that about 20% of our respondents cited that they ended up not enrolling at their matched school because they chose to stay at their existing school due to COVID-19. Now, again, how that would play out in the data that we showed previously is that on our end, in our data, we will see decreased enrollments from these families. But from a school level data perspective, you should likely see a higher re-enrollment rate. So again, emphasizing the importance of keeping all of these numbers in context of the overall picture of enrollment. We also conducted quite a bit of phone banking efforts to support families who had been matched with a school in their enrollment efforts. And so we typically focus our phone banking efforts on families that we want to support heavily. So this is in our target wards of 1, 4, 7, and 8. And then citywide, any non-English, any families that have indicated a language other than English as their primary spoken language at home. And then any families who in their application do not provide any email addresses. These are families that we think may have greater digital or technical challenges. So we reached almost 6,000 families, and some of the primary challenges that families cited when we were supporting them was not being able to get in contact with a school. So they were calling a general number rather than an enrollment specific number, and sometimes the general numbers are not being forwarded properly, or they may be forwarded to someone's cell phone that they may not necessarily be on at that exact moment. And so our phone bankers were supporting families with getting in contact with the right individuals. Additionally, we did see that families that live in Ward 8, families who had a language barrier, and families who didn't have email addresses listed were also reporting lower contact rates in the other direction, in that they were receiving less contact from schools. And so we know that this was a challenge for families as they were trying to learn about the enrollment process, understand what being matched meant in the next step of enrolling at a school. And finally, we always ask about ease of enrollment for families. We ask this on a scale of 1 to 5. And historically, we have seen pretty high, strong numbers here, around 4.5, 4.6, which is awesome, because enrollment, even in non-COVID, can be a challenging process. So it's always great to see this. This year, we did see a natural drop due to the shift to online enrollment. So the overall numbers did stay above 4, which I think is something that schools should be proud of, given all of the work that went into standing up online enrollment systems and shifting staff to be remote as well. One thing we did notice, however, is that the drop in ease of enrollment was stronger for our Spanish-speaking families, and many of them did cite issues of not having someone at the school who can support them in Spanish or provide documentation in Spanish to help them through the enrollment process. Additionally, some of the responses that we saw from families around the supports that would help them make the enrollment process easier was specifically around a lack of clarity, I think, around the big picture of the process. So knowing whether they were done with enrollment, if they had submitted all of the documentation necessary, and also understanding the difference between re-enrolling at a school and the documents that are necessary for that versus newly enrolling at a school. And so I think it's particularly important to keep these concerns in mind as we think about outreach moving forward, which Aryan will chat about next. But again, want to pause here before we move on to that section. And again, see if there are any questions either about this specifically or about the data that sparked something. And also if there's anything that, for the schools that are on the call as well, anything that you have experienced in challenges to enrollment or ways that you've been able to support, for example, your Spanish-speaking families in this process that you think is worth sharing with other schools as well.
Michelle, there are currently no questions in the chat or the session Q&A functions.
Awesome. Aryan, do you wanna?
Yeah, thank you. So given the feedback that we heard from families, we want to briefly touch on the role outreach plays in enrollment. Some of you may still be in the thick of outreach to stabilize enrollment numbers for the coming school year, and most know that recruitment and engagement is a year-long practice, both to retain current students, which is becoming incredibly relevant at this point in time, as well as welcome new ones. So go to the next slide. At this moment, we know that schools are working to stabilize their enrollment numbers, with those that are under-enrolled actively recruiting and extending waitlist offers. So some things to keep in mind while you're doing that. Do you have a clear step for families or steps for families so that they can make timely decisions? And something that we're hearing anecdotally through our hotline and through emails that we receive at My School DC, and through our phone banking efforts, is that families are unable to readily find all of the enrollment information that they may need for their child in order to make an actionable decision, in order to take the next steps. And something else to keep in mind is that a family of multiple children may have children enrolled in multiple schools and multiple sectors. So one family that may be attending one charter school may have another child attending another charter school or a DCPS school, where enrollment processes vary. So it's incredibly important, if you haven't stood up sort of a clear step-by-step way to enroll a student at your school, to think through that. And as our phone banking efforts showed, it's incredibly important to have a stable point of contact, a phone number, an email address for a family to get in touch with someone at your school. And now that we're at the point where the common enrollment deadline is passed and you're issuing waitlist offers to families, you know, traditionally the waitlist time frame for a family to act on that offer, it varies by school, and it may have been shorter in years past. But think through the challenges that families and schools have had throughout the common enrollment period, and take that into consideration with the time frame that you will give a family to act on a waitlist offer, given the challenges that they may be experiencing at home and accessing your school. So just make sure that lines of communication are open and that you're actively reaching out to families to make sure that they know that they have the waitlist offer, and also know how to act on it. Similarly, please make sure that all the contact information is up to date in the centralized waitlist management system, which is the system that we use and My School DC uses with the schools, so that families can contact you easily. Whatever is in that system is the information that we give out to families. So if there is a phone number that is incorrect, we want to make sure that that is corrected quickly, so that we're also providing good and actionable data to contact information to families. We can go to the next slide. And so as most of you know, the lottery process is an annual cycle. As you can see, we're less than 5 months out from launching the application for the 2021-2022 school year, which is bonkers to even think about that. But the silver lining is that schools have a timeline and can plan accordingly. So you saw that the enrollment deadline got extended to June. So we had additional time for families to make that decision, whether or not to accept their match. But now that we have less than 5 months away, let's think about how we can pivot. Given the success that you've had in how you've pivoted already, given COVID and how you're engaging with families, think about how you're going to apply those successful strategies into your recruitment and retention strategies or processes moving forward for the upcoming school year. So we can go to the next slide. So the information found in these bullets shouldn't be new information to any of you involved in recruitment, enrollment, or family engagement. However, given the impact of COVID that COVID has had on our sectors, it may help to think through how you'll continue to find the strategies that work well for you in your operations, as well as the particular communities that you serve. So here we just have the basic steps to a baseline recruitment plan that we at My School DC have found helpful. So thinking through assessing what has worked well during this enrollment season and what those challenges have been to actually engaging families to act, whether it's been digital literacy, whether it's been not being able to access a family due to a bad phone number, how you've been able to access a family through other social networks, phone banking efforts, et cetera. There are schools that have shared with us that they've offered Uber rides to come and do in-person enrollment at the schools. So thinking through what has worked well during this very unprecedented time and how you're going to be carrying that forth to next year. What will your communications plan look like? This is incredibly important because messaging needs to be consistent for a family, both to have good faith in your school and how it's going to move forward given this unprecedented time, but also, of course, given that children may be in various sectors, knowing how to act and what clearly your school will be providing is incredibly important. So when you provide information to be displayed on My School DC's website, make sure that that information is consistent and carried over and can be clearly seen on your website as well. And similarly, when you're talking to a parent about all the amazing things that your schools offer, make sure that that aligns with anything that is publicly available on our site as well as yours. How will you leverage and align your profiles on My School DC's site with your website? So again, just making sure that that communication is consistent. How will you continue family engagement from the launch of the application in December onward? And this is becoming increasingly interesting, exciting, nerve-wracking that we've had to pivot to this sort of virtual world, and families are learning how to do that too. So we're all somewhat learning together what works and what hasn't worked. But how are you going to continue to engage families after a virtual open house session, for example, a potential virtual event, a Facebook Live event? Thinking through that social distancing will still be a thing moving forward this winter and potentially in the spring, and how that will play a role in your engagement. And then who will you partner with? I'm sure you have already a long list of networks and partners that are reliable entities to you in getting that critical messaging out to your families, being a good partner in recruitment for you, and thinking through if those organizations will continue to be just that for you, or if you have to think about different partners to help you get the word out. Also, if you're a school that has a feeder, thinking through maybe a little bit differently how you use the feeder schools that feed into your school and those family networks to make sure that they're all in line and all completely understand what to expect from elementary, middle, and high school. And then finally, some tips and some things to keep in mind. Because this process is so cyclical, there are various sort of milestones that you can hit each month of the process. And this slide right here sort of shows an 8-month time frame from application launch to enrollment and start of school, which is typically end of August, beginning of September. So again, I know it's we're still trying to get through enrollment for this upcoming school year, but given that the lottery application will launch in less than 5 months for 21-22, thinking through how you're going to approach that effort is really critical. So when the application launches, and I won't read everything, I just think the 2 things here to keep in mind are don't lose sight of your currently enrolled students. That student body has become incredibly important, especially now given the impact of COVID. Think through the holidays, and I'm sure you already have a plan in mind for these, but families tend to sort of escape to other things during the holiday season, so applying to school may not be top of mind. And make sure that you're capturing those families that have applied to your school early on and engaging them so that you are top of mind for them. During the application period, continue to maintain contact with applicants, but also start thinking about how you're going to approach enrollment for 21-22. Will it be different from what you did April through June of this year? Or has this been a more successful attempt at enrolling students than in years past that you're going to continue to move forward, which is what we've heard from quite a few schools actually. And then finally, during the enrollment period, hopefully our enrollment cycle will continue to remain the same or revert back to that early May timeframe. So making sure that you're reassessing and analyzing the data that you've collected. We have a great amount of reports through our centralized waitlist management system that Michelle will touch on that provide really wonderful data for you to act on. And then make sure you're staying in contact with your wait list, keeping them engaged. Even if you have a long wait list, it doesn't hurt to make sure that families know about your option, your school and what you offer. Again, given COVID and the fact that folks are tending to stay in their current school and re-enrolling, wait lists have become more important than ever at this period of time. So all things that I'm sure that you think about annually for your school, but it doesn't hurt to sort of take a look at that plan and build it out maybe a little bit differently from what you've learned this enrollment season for the coming 21-22 cycle.
Awesome. So we'll pause there again, see if anyone has any questions, any suggestions that they want to share with the group as well before moving on to our next section.
And it looks like we do not currently have any chats or Q&As or Qs.
Awesome. All right, so our next section, getting back into some of the data, this is now thinking about how can you leverage your own information and your own data, given the context of what we've shared around citywide enrollment and around the outreach strategies. So I think before we kind of dive into some of the specific resources and specific numbers, as you are thinking about using your data to plan for enrollment, there are a few key questions that we'd recommend thinking about. One is how are you thinking about the makeup of your enrollment historically? And so when we say makeup, we're thinking how many of your students who enroll every year in a given grade are typically re-enrolling students? How many of them are lottery applicants? And then how many of them are post-lottery applicants? Having some of those numbers broken down can, I think, help you set in stone what your historic benchmarks have been. And then you can use some of that to then think about, okay, how are we tracking this year for each of those specific groups? And what does the impact of one group necessarily mean for your outreach to another group if you are trying to still reach the same enrollment targets that you may have set it historically? And finally, how are you adapting the number of offers that you are extending through My School DC to meet some of your current enrollment needs? And so I think thinking through each of these pieces, both individually and then together, can help you set in stone, okay, this is the path. Now that we have some data from the last couple of months of what enrollment has looked like this year, for what we can do in August and September to make sure that we're set up for success when it comes to meeting our enrollment plans. And so we'll share a few specific My School DC resources for you over the next couple of slides, and then how you can use them. Namely, the two resources that we're going to talk about are your year-end report and then the information that is available to you within the centralized waitlist management system or Salesforce. So first off, the year-end report. I think this report this year can help you a lot with just understanding your historical numbers. It does specifically show you your lottery versus post-lottery breakout when it comes to enrollment. And so there is a chart in there that you can see an example of on the right-hand side that shows you how many of your new students came from matched families and when did they enroll over the course of the summer. How many of your enrollments came from lottery families who received a waitlist offer, and then how many came from post-lottery families who received a waitlist offer. And so I think it's important to think about these groups separately because they all do have different behaviors. Your matched lottery families, heard from you back in March. They've had a significant amount of time to make their decisions, and you'll see in this example, and I think in most examples, they typically make their decision around the enrollment deadline before and sometimes slightly after. But once we start moving further and further from that enrollment deadline, I think this becomes a group that maybe you can rely on less to end up enrolling at your school based on when they initially heard from you. And then lottery families who received a waitlist offer from you and post-lottery families, they are applying at different times, they're hearing from you at different times. And this year in particular, we know that there are fewer post-lottery families who are applying. And so I think thinking about that number specifically will become important as you create your own context. So I do want to pause here. I know our chat has been a little bit quiet, but hopefully we can get some responses here. I think one thing I am curious about is, for your schools, as you are planning for your enrollment, what are some of the groups that you are thinking about specifically when you are doing some of those comparisons, and what have you seen? We have some examples here of ways that schools may have broken it out or may want to break it out to spark maybe some thinking, and some example hypotheses for the ways that you may be thinking about these groups. So you may expect higher re-enrollment rates than you have historically because you think these families are probably going to stay. You handled distance learning well in the spring, you got good feedback, and you feel like you have strong communications with your families for the fall. For your entry-level lottery applicants, you may expect to see lower numbers this year, especially if your entry grades are pre-K 3, knowing that families may be opting out this year. If your entry grade, starts at 6th grade or at 9th grade, that may not look as sharp of a decline because the feeder schools that your families have historically come from do end, and they need another option, and so they may still be enrolling. This could look very different for your non-entry level grade lottery applicants because, again, the same way that you may be experiencing higher re-enrollment because your families are choosing to stay with you, some of these families may be less likely to switch this school year. Post-lottery applicants, as we've mentioned, you may be seeing fewer post-lottery applicants in general, and so the way that you're thinking about this group may look different than in previous years. And then finally, a non-lottery way to think about this. You may think about your families who historically have come from outside of DC, whether that's represented a large chunk or a small chunk of your families, what COVID-19 means for the mobility of families, and whether they may be less likely to even move to DC in the first place. So these are some examples that we put together. I would love for us to be able to share anything else that schools are thinking about specifically, or if you are not a school, any other ways that you think schools could be thinking about how they're breaking out and parsing out their enrollment groups. All right, well, I don't want to pull teeth on this one. And hopefully this means this is a different way for you to be thinking about your enrollment. If you have thoughts moving forward, definitely feel free to reach out to us and share them. We're always curious how schools are thinking about this, and therefore how we can adapt some of our resources or support you in that process. So mull on that one for a little bit. Awesome. Now, one important metric that we often use and recommend for tracking purposes is a school's capture rate. Some schools call it yield, meaning how many students who receive an offer ultimately end up enrolling. Because remember, when the process starts with an application, those numbers do get whittled down over time to the number of students who end up receiving an offer, because not all of your applicants will receive an offer from you. And then the number that actually end up enrolling. So for context, we do see that from the school perspective, in 1920, about 37% of offers resulted in an enrollment. So about 1 in 3 offers resulted in an enrollment. And again, this number is grounded very much in the fact that while you may be giving out your offers and thinking about the specific student, they may also be receiving offers from other schools. And in the end, they can only end up holding one enrollment. And so from the student perspective, you know, we do see that 80-something% of our applicants end up enrolling at a school through My School DC. But from the school perspective, that yield rate is still fairly low because we know that students are juggling multiple offers. And so within your year-end report, this contains your 1920 capture rate. And so we show you your capture rate by grade. So for every grade level, how many of your enrollments, how many of your offers resulted in an enrollment. And we also compare it both to your historic numbers, so you can see how you are trending. Oftentimes schools do see that this number is pretty steady year over year. We also compare this to the district capture rate to give you a sense of how your school is doing relative to other schools in the district. And then specifically how your school is doing relative to other schools in your ward. And so looking at some of these numbers historically, I know many schools use this as part of their planning, use this as they think about the number of offers they should be extending. But I also know that we send this data out in December. This year, as you think about your own numbers, you may be wanting some of that information a little bit more in real time. And so I'll spend a little bit of time over the next slide talking about how to calculate your capture rate live and where you can find the right information to do that. For the sake of time, I'm not going to delve too much into the actual mechanics of going through the Excel, because I also know we have a few My School DC participating schools on the line. But hopefully with your own data, you can also run through some of these calculations. So overall, the calculation is fairly straightforward. I think the big question is where to get the data. The calculation again is just what is your total enrollments over the total number of offers that you are extending. And again, as we think about, okay, what are the different subgroups that make up your total enrollment, something to think about is what does your match capture rate look like versus your waitlist capture rate. And as you are planning for August and September and how you are making offers, knowing what your waitlist capture rate is may be more important than your match capture rate. And the fact that those two numbers can look different can also help you in your planning process. So again, your match capture rate would just be your enrollments from a match over the total number of students that were matched to you. Versus your waitlist capture rate would be your total enrollments from students who received a waitlist offer over the total number of waitlist offers that you extended. And again, looking at maybe what your waitlist capture rate has been this year versus historically may help shift some of your patterns or behaviors. I think some schools may, especially if they've been doing this year over year, get used to saying, okay, well, I need to extend 2 offers to get 1 student enrolled. And so that's what I'm used to doing. But if you see that your capture rate this year is significantly lower than last year, you may actually want to be extending 4 offers for every 1 seat that you want to fill. I think this is definitely a very school-specific decision and requires a mix of looking at the data that you're seeing and also what you are hearing from your leadership, what you know your school is able to handle in terms of capacity. And so where to get some of this information? Within Salesforce for the My School DC participating schools that are on the line, the complete applicant record shows you all of your applicants' current status and their previous status. And so if you're trying to determine just the top half, so the total enrollments from your waitlist offers, you would want to say, okay, how many students are currently enrolled and had a previous status of a waitlist offer? And so that would tell you of your specific enrollments, who came from a waitlist offer. And then for the bottom, how many of your applicants either have a current status as a waitlist offer, so that means their offer is still open and they have not made a decision yet, or they have a previous status of a waitlist offer, regardless of what their current status is, because you do want to make sure that you're including in here your declined students. students who enrolled and then chose to enroll at another school. All of these count as offers that you've extended. And so for the sake of time, I'm not going to delve too far into the data. We did share in the library that has our resources and our materials an example of dummy data if you want to play with some numbers that are either not yours or just a smaller subset if you're a multi-campus LEA. Play with calculating this yourself so that over the course of this summer, you can keep track of that number and adjust accordingly. And so as we wrap up, I do want to ground us back in some of the guiding questions that we started this section with. We definitely encourage you to take a lot of what we have shared early on and bring it into the context of your own school to make your decisions and to make sure that you are thinking kind of about this in different pieces of who are your students and how are they enrolling, how are we doing versus last year in each of these groups separately, and therefore how are we adjusting our actions this year accordingly, so that you can make the decisions in this really challenging environment to help set you up for success for this coming school year and, as hard as it is to imagine, school year 21-22 as well.